Hello and welcome to this video for Art 149. This is class number 8. We'll have two parts to today's video. Part number 1 here will be about lenses, and part number 2 will be about creativity and style. So, we need to do the dad joke. Here's the dad joke. The dad joke is, where do you take someone who's been injured in a peekaboo accident? A peekaboo accident. You take them to the ICU. ICU, intensive care unit. ICU. Get it? Alrighty, let's talk about lenses. Let's talk about lenses. I have a few. This isn't even all of them. Anyway, lenses. So we're going to talk about lenses today. They are the part of your camera that is going to probably wind up being your biggest investment in photography. They're complicated, they require precision, and they help you tell stories. There's lenses for almost every type of photography. There are general purpose lenses, there are special purpose lenses. What you're seeing here on screen is a little bit older image of the Canon lens lineup. So yeah, there's a few lenses out there. And it's really, you got to remember with lenses, you can't take a Canon lens and put it on an Nikon or put it on a Sony without an adapter, which often lends to clunkiness. So lenses, they are super important elements in creating quality images, as well as telling the story you want with your image. So we're going to talk about both of those things in this lecture. The technical side of things, how we specify lenses, what they're used for, how to use them, and how they impact the story. All right, so let's get started just a little bit here. I'm showing you on screen here a sad thing. This was a lens I broke. At my son's graduation, high school graduation, I dropped this lens and it broke. So I decided to take it apart and see what was inside and what makes it tick. And after I did that, I have a new appreciation for why lenses are expensive. Looking at all these parts, and I think that's most of the parts, and I had to cut some wires and clip, because it was broken already. So, I mean, it was a major operation to take this thing apart. You can see all the little tiny screws and washers at the top. I think that's most of them. I probably lost one or two along the way. There's a printed circuit board, so there's some computer stuff going on. There's a motor inside of this that drives the focusing. Obviously, you've got all these glass elements. So, and these are hand assembled. So the individual components are probably computer automated and machined, but when the lens comes time to put the pieces together, that's done by hand. And that's a big part of why these are so expensive. Also, they're done in these super clean rooms, so that no imperfections get in here. And yeah, it's totally different looking at a lens when it's taken apart, when some of its different elements, than when it's whole and you're used to looking at it like this. Seeing inside's kind of interesting. Probably the most fascinating part to me, I don't know how well you can see this. This is the Aputure Blades. These are the Aputure Blades. And what amazed me with this, I'm going to try and show it to you because I can open this. Can I? How do I do it? There you go. All right. What amazes me with this is a little plastic element, and inside of that, these blades of the Aputure, they're a very thin metal, almost like aluminum foil, but just a little thicker. So that makes them really light. They can move quickly and all that good stuff. So there's the Aputure. You can see that's not a very big opening. That's not a very big opening. I've not taken apart one of my lenses that opens larger, but that's what 5.6 looks like. Yeah. Okay. Moving on. So let's talk about how we specify lenses, how the numbers and what matters and all that good stuff. So Just like we do with cars. It's a 4-door, it's got this much horsepower, it gets this much miles per gallon, it's good for this kind of use. Okay, here we go. So we start with talking about lenses. The first specification we discuss is the focal length. Focal length. And what that does is it gives us a sense of what the lens sees. The field of view. Does it see wide? Does it see not a lot? Or somewhere in between? So that's what focal length gives you a sense of. Okay? So generally we have 3 general categories of lenses: wide angle, normal, and telephoto. Those are the kind of 3 broad categories. There's super wide angle and super telephoto. But yeah, so, okay. Let's talk more about focal length. And focal length is measured in millimeters. What it is a distance of where the focal point happens in the lens, how far that distance is from the sensor. Okay? Don't worry too much about that, but that's what it's measuring. The point at which the light is focused, how far away from the sensor is that? So the smaller numbers, which are usually in the low teens to the upper 20s, we call that wide angle. So you can stand in a spot and see a lot of the subject. You can see wide. Okay. Okay. Then we get to the middle numbers, somewhere mid 30s to mid 80s, and that's called a standard lens, normal. The reason for that is that focal length is very close to replicating the field of view from our eyes. Now, our eyes are pretty amazing because in addition to what we see, we also have the peripheral part, this part that's off to the side. So this mimics basically the shoulder width part of your eye view, the main part of what you see. So oftentimes those kind of standard lenses are used for documentary type photography, for journalism, because it pretty much looks like what it looked like. The wide angle lenses are often used for landscapes, real estate, things where you need the whole big picture. And then last up, we have the telephoto lenses, which are the larger numbers, usually starting around 100, and then they go to 400 and beyond. For most of us mere mortals, 400 is the most we'll likely deal with. There are some 800 and 1200 millimeter lenses out there. They're kind of huge and kind of expensive on the cameras they go with. All right. Let's talk a little bit more about some math. And it's a little confusing, but I'm going to cover it anyway because it's important. And that is what's called focal length equivalence. I know. You didn't think you'd have this much fun today, but you are. So focal length equivalence, here's why it matters. In photography, there's kind of become this standard way of, when we talk about whether a lens is wide angle, telephoto, or standard, the reference point for that is the old 35 millimeter camera, okay? Because 35 millimeter film was the most common and popular type of camera used. So people got used to talking about what the lens saw in terms of to that size media. So the 35 millimeter is the kind of the typical reference point for that field of view. So in terms of, we don't use film anymore, but we have sensors, and the sensors come in different sizes. So relative to this, and so think of the 35 millimeter film as being a sensor, and it was 35 millimeters from corner to corner, so that diagonal dimension. So that's what we're dealing with. So that's our frame of reference digitally as well, is this 35 millimeter film. So when we talk about, the wide angle stuff is 10 to 35, that's in reference to 35 millimeter sensors. I'll get to more about that in just a second. Actually, in the next slide. All right, so I'm going to put up a graphic here to help us understand this. So here is, this shape is the shape of relative size of what's called a full frame sensor. So it's approximately the same size as a 35 millimeter piece of film in the most common popular film camera years ago. Okay, so that's our frame of reference. You'll notice it's a different ratio, width to height, than the computer screen or TV screen, which is, this is 4:3, 3:4, 4:3, 3:2, I don't remember, versus 16:9, which your screen, your TV screen is, okay? I know, math, ratios. So for most of us, most of us don't have cameras with sensors this large. Most of us have cameras with digital sensors that are called crop sensors. They're smaller, about 24 millimeter by 16 millimeter on the width and height. Okay, so that leads us, so you can see it's smaller. That blue area is smaller than the orange, which represents the full frame. So this camera that I use is a crop sensor. This camera that many of you have or similar, the Rebel or the entry-level Nikon, is also a crop sensor. Sensor in these is about the same size, give or take like a 0.5 millimeter. So we're dealing with crop sensors, which leads us to a thing you'll hear or read if you do much research about lenses and photography. This thing called a crop factor. And the crop factor is 1.5 because when you divide the width of the smaller sensor into the larger sensor you get, it's 1.5 times. To get from the small one to the big one, you have to multiply by 1.5. So it's 50% smaller. Here's what that means and why they call it a crop. So you're going to think about the crop tool in Lightroom as we do this, okay? Think about the crop tool. So this is the full frame view. This is what, we'll start here, and then instead I'm going to take that same scene and now look at it with a lens, the same focal length lens, but now I'm looking at it on a smaller sensor, the crop sensor. It's like you use the crop tool in Lightroom. In effect, you're zooming in, kind of, sort of, but not really. Really what you're doing is restricting what's in the frame, which has the effect somewhat of, looks like you're zooming in. So I have 50% less of the scene to see on the same focal length on this sensor because the sensor is smaller. So as the light comes through a lens and hits a sensor, it's hitting a smaller sensor, so it's going to show and render less of the scene. How you doing? Is that making sense? It's a little complicated, I know. The reason I tell you that is because most of the lenses I'm going to show you, the focal length, you kind of have to adapt it to understand what it means, whether it's wide angle, telephoto, or standard. So what I want to do is show you some examples of photos for each of the different categories of lenses, talk a little bit about their typical use, and then also talk about, don't just use it for the typical use, especially when you're in an art class, when you're in a creative endeavor. Just because one kind of lens isn't a portrait lens doesn't mean you can't point it at someone's face and take a photo. Okay, so let's start with wide angle lenses. Wide angle lenses, so those are the ones that are the smaller focal length numbers and they see more of a given scene. So let's just take a look at some examples. And I'll show you then also what the focal length was of the lens that took the photo. So this is a very, very typical wide angle photo. It's landscape. It's a scene. This is from Cary Park in Seattle. So you get this typical view of Seattle and the Puget Sound there. Boom, looking south. Okay. The focal length here is 17 millimeters on my crop sensor. So if you multiply 17 by 1.5, you get about 24. That's what the number in parentheses is. So you get less of a field of view. So a 17 millimeter focal length on a crop sensor has the same field of view-ish as a 24 millimeter on a full frame camera. So you do that conversion because when someone says they're using a wide angle or telephoto, most people's frame of reference, again, is the focal lengths that fall in assuming a standard size sensor, the full frame. Okay, I know, sorry. wide-angle lenses are great when you're in a small space. So this is Rosie the Art Bus again, Carrie Schmidt's bus. This is at 10 millimeters, so it's really wide. It's actually with this lens here at 10 millimeters in a school bus, a small school bus, not one of the monster ones, kind of the medium-sized ones. And it makes what happens when you do this is it makes it look a little larger. So this gets also used in real estate photography to make a small room like this, and I'll show you an example, it look a little larger. Okay, you can use them for photos of people. Here's the wedding photo. This is at 15 millimeters, so that works out to right around 23, 24 millimeters. Yeah, so you can do group shots. You'll start noticing something with wide-angle lenses here. One of the things they do is they tend to distort, especially around the edges and when you're close. Relationships of objects with wide-angle lenses the way the lens renders it is different than it looks when you're looking at it with your eye. So these people all look a little taller. I put the lens lower, so I wanted that. I wanted them to look lower. So the camera's down low, I'm down lower. And it kind of, well, they are leaning in a little bit, but especially if you look at the guy on the far right, he's starting to look a little stretchy, a little wider. That's generally what happens with wide-angle lenses. Again, for showcasing and accentuating heights, look at tall things from right below, and boom, you get taller. This is at 17 millimeters again, so that's about 25 millimeter equivalent on a full frame sensor. Okay, so that's wide angle. You can do portraits with it. You can do any kind of photography with a wide angle lens. It's just got a different look to it than maybe most people traditionally expect. Hey, but that's cool. That's art. Let's talk about standard type lens examples. These were some of the hardest to find for me in my sample library because I tend not to take photos very much at this focal length. I've already seen it at that, that's what my eyes are generally seeing. So I usually want to be wider or closer. I tend not to like as much artistically the photos in the middle focal lengths, middle exposures, middle whatever. So here's, this is at, let's see, what do we got? This is 44 millimeters, so that's right around 66 equivalent. Just kind of a standard view. That's about what it looked like when I was standing there looking at it. So again, the nice thing about this focal length is it tends to render things in a way that is very similar to how it looked when you were there looking at it. So that's an advantage. It's a direct interpretation. So that means you got to be a little more creative with your composition because the lens isn't going to bring any creativity, very much creativity to the party and the way it renders the scene. Looking through this door at a wedding, grandma dancing with one of her grandsons at the wedding, using the door as a framing element. Again, when I'm standing there looking at it, this is what it looked like. This was taken with a 35 millimeter, which works out to about 52 equivalent on a full frame sensor. My Blue Lake photo was also at 35. I'd forgotten this was at 35. I was kind of surprised when I came across this. I thought it was a little wider, but it's hard to tell because there's nothing in it except for the dock on the left. There's no landmarks really or things to latch onto to give you sense of scale and size, which is one of the reasons I love this photo. And then lastly, you can do detail shots obviously with these. You can do portraits, you can do details. So here's a detail of a car, an old Jaguar, also right around 33 millimeters, which works out to just about 50 millimeters. So yeah, standard focal length. You get different kinds of views, but what it does in the end, if you were at that position where your lens is, that's about the kind of view you're going to get with a standard focal length. Whereas if I'm up close with a wide-angle lens, I'm going to get exaggerations of size and shape and some distortion from a wide-angle lens. Okay. And then last but not least, telephoto lenses and examples of telephoto photos. So these are were easy to find, this is what I tend to do. So this is a really typical example of a telephoto lens. It lets you reach out from a long way away and get closer to something that you, for one reason or another, you couldn't get close to. Like with the bunny here, if I got close, they would run away and it would just disturb them. So don't do that. From a distance with the bunny here, yeah, this is at 140 millimeters, which works out to about 210 millimeters on, if you multiply 140 by 1.5. The way, I don't know how you do math like this. 1.5 is you divide it in half and then add that to it. So 140 divided by 2 is 70 plus 140 is 210. Math. All right. Here's one of the things I love about telephoto lenses. Like wide angle, it represents the depth of the scene differently than it looks like when you're standing there looking at it. Wide angle tends to distort, make things look taller, wider, and things like that, especially around the edges. What telephoto does is it compresses the distance and tends to render the background more blurry. So in this photo of Natalie and her dad at the first dance at her daddy-daughter dance at her wedding, obviously they're the most important part. And the people in the background are nice for context, but I don't need them for detail. I don't want them in focus. The flowers in front that I'm kind of using as a little foreground element, also don't need to see the details there, just again, a little bit of context and color. I certainly don't want to see the DJ speaker that's on the top left. I don't want that to be in focus. I don't want to see the logo. I just want to keep it simple. And a telephoto lens here, this is at about 115 millimeters, so that's about 173. I had to get the calculator out for this one. Yeah. So I love telephoto lenses for this. I love getting close without being physically close. They can then do their thing without me sticking a camera in their face. I can be just around the edges, and I really enjoy that. I use telephoto lenses for like profile photos and portrait photos a lot. So this is just, the typical head and shoulder shot. And again, the background goes blurry. One of the cool things I enjoy about telephoto lenses, at any given aperture, so let's say f4, or let's do 5.6 because that's a common one. 5.6, you'll get less in focus in the background, so a blurrier background at 140 millimeters at 5.6 than you will at 50 millimeters at 5.6, or you will at 10 millimeters. Okay, so the more zoomed in you are, the more telephoto you are, the blurrier your background will tend to be. So you'll have shallower depth of field, so you got to really work on your focus. So again, this is 115 millimeters, 173 equivalent on a full frame. So this will be the most telephoto photo I'll show you, and Blue Angels, so I couldn't get super close, but my lens could. So this is a 280 millimeter focal length, and what it is, I have an adapter for this lens. This is my 50 to 140, which is equivalent to a 75 to 210. But I have a teleconverter that makes it 2 times, so it makes it a 200 to 280. No, 100 to 280. Math, sorry. Yeah. So you get up close, personal, you start to see the feathers, not the feathers, I'm not sure what that is around the edge of the top of the cockpit, but it's a totally different view of the front of the airplane here. It compresses things, makes things look different than if you're just standing there looking at it. Both from obviously you can get closer and see the details with the lens, but also it changes the relative relationship of foreground to background, blurry background. Speaking of that, so I'm going to show you a sequence of photos of my wife, Debbie, that I took on our front porch just to show how, especially on faces, this is really easy to see how when you go from wide angle to telephoto, how shapes change in how the lens renders shapes, as well as how background and foreground look relative to each other, okay? So we're going to start at 18 millimeters. So here's what I'm going to do in all. I'm going to see 6 photos total. What I'm going to do in the photos is keep Debbie's portrait here about the same size. So it's going to be just top of her head to right about here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my distance, because when I'm using the 18 millimeter lens, I'm probably about this far away from Debbie. I'm probably a foot to a foot and a half away from her. So the lens is pretty close. I'm in her face. So look at what it does to faces. It tends to exaggerate things. Like the back of her face looks farther away, like her cheeks and her ears. So that has the effect of making her nose look bigger. It just changes. It makes her eyes look like they're farther away. So it makes her head like the phrase I use is kind of like a balloon head. It's just it's distorted. It's distorted. You can start to see a little bit of the address on the frame right, camera right, and you can see the background. It's blurry, but you get a sense of what's going on there. There's some trees and greenery. Okay, let's go to 35 millimeters. So look at the shape of her face has changed now. It's not as, okay, so starting to look more like she looks like. So there's that. Again, the background is getting a little blurrier now, a little blurrier. Let's go to 50 millimeters. There you go. So again, face shape is changing a little bit. We'll go to 70. Background relationships changing. The background's getting even more blurry. There's 93. I'm not sure why I did 93. I think I just kind of guessed. And then we went to 135. Okay. So as you get more telephoto on, if you're doing this kind of photo, a headshot, a profile photo. I hate saying headshot. It's such a violent sounding term. I'm now saying profile photo, just for my own sanity. I think it's a more flattering look on 95% of people's faces. Certainly more so than the 18 millimeter kind of clown head and balloon head. And the 50's okay. That's again, so you got to multiply these numbers by 1.5. So that 50 millimeter is kind of equivalent to a 75. The 18 would be equivalent to a 27. 27? Yeah, 27. Okay? Consider that. What do you want to do with shapes and relationships of objects to the background as part of the story of the photos you're creating? Do you want to distort and make things look bigger, smaller, make them look closer, farther? Lots of options for this, and lenses can help you do that. Okay, that's some of the power of lenses. Superpower. Okay, so let's talk about the basic categories of lenses. But before we do that, one of the things I want to talk about is how we, again, I started this conversation, but I didn't finish it, how we specify lenses, how we talk about what they do. So I mentioned already, we measure lenses, their field of view, we measure that in millimeters. The other feature we talk about when we name a lens, when we specify it, is we let you know, we include what the maximum aperture is. The widest opening the lens will do. They will also do smaller openings, but the widest one is the one we're most interested in because we need to know how much light it's going to grab. So, for example, this lens is a 50 millimeter f2. So it's a 50 f2. That means the largest lens opening is f2, lets in that amount of light, which is quite a large opening. It will also click all the way over to the smaller side to f16, but we don't care about that so much. Well, we care, but it's not as important. So 50 millimeter f2, if you have a zoom lens, also what you'll do is you'll specify the zoom range. So this is a 10 to 24. Do the multiplying. So if the crop factor on this is make it a 15 to 36, this 50 becomes 1.5 times is 75 millimeter in full frame equivalent. So you got to do the math, at least in the background of your brain. 50 millimeter, I'm sorry, this is a 10 to 24 millimeter f4. Okay. So let's talk about categories of lenses. We've just seen them. There's two categories of lenses I just showed you. The first one is the prime lens. A prime lens is like this one I'm holding in my hand, and it has a single focal length, so a single field of view with the lens. So that means if you want to zoom with this lens, this is how you do it. You move. You get closer or farther away to your subject with the whole camera and your body. You got to move because this only sees one field of view. So you got to move the lens to change that. Okay, so that's a trade-off. But here's what you get as a result of that. You get lenses that tend to be smaller. So here's that zoom I showed you. Here's another zoom. So it's a little smaller than this. Okay, this is a 50 to 140 millimeter. This is just 50, a little smaller. They generally tend to be smaller, lighter because they're smaller. Less so now, but they do tend to be just a little bit sharper, especially around the edges and all sorts of techie, nerdy things. The type of photography I do, it's not super important. Or super critical to me, I should say. And then they generally have, the main advantage to this type of lens is they have larger maximum apertures. So even though this is a 50 to 140 and it's huge, it's an f2.8. This is an f2.0. So this big monster lets in less light than this little tiny guy. f2, 2.8, less light. Okay, how you doing? You doing okay? Okay, yeah, math, numbers, stuff. So that's prime lenses. I only have two prime lenses currently. I have a 35 millimeter and the 50. So I'm going to tell you, give you some Uncle Michael advice if you are a Canon user. If you have a Canon camera, you should get this lens. This is the 50 millimeter f1.8. So it lets a lot of light in. 1.8. It's a small number, so it means it's a large opening, lets lots and lots of light in. Okay. It's a great value. They're about usually $120 to $130. Often at holiday times and at sale times, you can get them really close to $100 even. And for the value, that's just a great deal. I know $100 is a lot of money. $130 is a lot of money. But as far as lenses go, it's not a lot of money. It's a little money. So f1.8. Now let me give you an example while we're here, because we have all this extra time, right? And you're done. You got nowhere to go. I know you do, but let's pretend you don't. You can hit pause now and come back in a second if you need to. All right, so 50 millimeter 1.8. Canon makes two more of 50 millimeter lenses. They get larger openings, faster lenses. So because they're aperture's wider, more light, that means you could have a faster shutter speed. They let in more light. Okay, so the 1.8 version, this is the size, and it's $130, let's just say. They make a 1.4 version, which is a third stop more, so just a bit more light. It's probably twice as big size and probably weight, and it's about $400 to get a third stop more. It's a little better quality camera lens as well, but I don't know that it's 3 times as good. Then Canon also has a 50 millimeter 1.2. And that is, how much is that? I think that one's $1,200. So you went from 130 to another third is 400 to another third, a stop, is 1,200. Yikes, so almost 10 times more. Well, 10 times more than this lens to get a little bit better image quality and a little more light. Some people, that's worth it. Most people, not so much. This is a great value, great value. Okay. Prime lenses. There you go. Let's keep moving. Let's talk about zoom lenses then. That's the other category of lenses. And zoom lenses are variable focal length. So that means you can zoom you can change your field of view from wide or from one to another without moving your feet. So just by on this one, you generally turn a ring on your camera, and the lens zooms. This one you can see it zooming because it's external zoom. Like if I do this one, you can't because it's zooming internally. I'm moving the thing, but nothing changes on the lens. You can see inside it is. But yeah, okay. Zoom lens, variable focal length. This, I'm a zoom guy. I tend to like zooms. They've been, for me, the most flexible type of lens, and I appreciate that because it reduces friction for me taking photos. I'm more than likely just to go create some photos with this kind of lens because it gives me lots of options without dropping things. When you change the lens, you might drop it. So don't do that, kids. All right. This is an 18, so it's a wide angle lens where it starts, and then you go all the way through to 135 millimeters. So now it's a telephoto lens, and it's an in-between lens, and it's a almost zoom, and it's a almost telephoto. All the stuff in between. Okay, so lots of flexibility. That's the advantage. The trade-off, this is larger. So this is, again, that 50 millimeter. This is larger than that. As you can see, probably, from how much light is getting in here, these also don't let as much light in. So that's the trade-off. I get flexibility, but I don't get as much light as one of these guys. And in fact, on the more affordable ones, the lenses the zoom lenses often have a variable maximum aperture, which means it will change as you zoom. So this lens that I'm holding, when I'm at 18 millimeters, so wide, I have 3.5 is my maximum aperture. So the largest opening is equivalent to 3.5 f-stop. When I zoom to 135, that maximum opening gets smaller to 5.6. So it lets in less light when it's zoomed to 135 than it does when it's at 18. It's a less expensive way to create lenses. Now, this is not an inexpensive lens by a long shot, but it's less expensive than this guy. So this is the lens I often use for portraits. I love this lens, especially for like profile photos, headshot kind of things. This is a 50 mil. This is a zoom lens. It's a 50 to 140, 18 to 135. Okay, so why is this so much bigger even though it covers less territory? Here's why. This lens has a larger maximum opening at 2.8 across the whole 50 to 140. Remember, this one is 3.5 to 5.6. So all the way across its range, it's letting in less light. And when it's zoomed, it's 1/4 as much light as this guy. So this lens is about half as much, again, as much money as this, 50% more price. It weighs about twice as much, but the images are amazing. I love this lens. This is a great, great lens. But this is the lens that's on my camera 90+% of the time because it does so much of what I need. It's a good compromise of size and weight. So, lenses. You have many options. There's lots of variety. You will need to recalibrate what the phrase expensive means because lenses like this lens cost more than this camera. But the nice thing about lenses, the technology that's in here, physics especially around how light works, doesn't change as quickly as the technology that's inside the camera body. This will be upgraded more quickly every 3 or so years than this. They maybe upgrade a lens like this every 10 years or so. And it doesn't mean this one is any worse. It just means there might be something a slightly bit better. So, how many lenses do you need? Good question. You need one. That's all you need. You need a lens on your camera. I have a friend who, for the longest time, this is her lens. She is a Canon photographer, and she only had this 50 millimeter, and she photographed weddings, portraits, babies, animals, landscapes, travel with this one lens. Okay, so you don't need to be crazy, go nuts like I kind of am. I just like the options. So, but you need one lens. After that, and obviously you can adapt your photography way you take photos to work with the lens you have. It's when you have limits, it helps you be more creative, which is what we're going to talk more about in the next video. Creativity. We're also going to talk about style, and style is influenced by the type of lens you use, plus a whole bunch of other things. So if you want to talk more about lenses, you know what to do. You're going to send me an email. I'm glad to help you think about lenses. I love nerding out about lenses. Or let's stop by and chat during the Zoom online time, where we can do some conversation rather than just me talking to the camera. So that's an introduction to lenses, how you can use them from what some typical uses are, how you talk about lenses, some definitions, how to use them creatively in your stories. And it's a very, very important part of the stories you create with your camera. So I hope that helps. Please feel free to let me know in the comments below if you do have questions or comments or suggestions or personal experiences, lens preferences, all that good stuff. So until we meet again, I will conclude this video now by saying, see you soon.